There are lots of ways we can interpret going to him happy letter. In this podcast, I'm going to explore 4 main ways that we can go about looking at the poem. We can, first of all, interpret that this is a poem about a letter to a lover. Secondly, we could think that this poem is actually, in fact, a poem about writing itself. It's not really a poem about writing a letter to a lover, but it's a poem that explores the craft of writing poetry. And in this way, it's meta. It's a poem about itself. It's a poem about writing poems. Typical for Dickinson, we could also explore it as a poem which highlights her relationship with God. And finally, it could be seen to emphasise certain ideas about female restriction and the role of women within society. In this poem, Dickinson personifies the letter, and the speaker talks directly to the letter. She forms a relationship with the letter, and we never hear the letter's voice back, but we hear the speaker talking to the letter and explaining what decisions she has made in terms of the letter that she has written. The first way that we could interpret this poem is as a love letter. We have the opening, going to him happy letter, with the joyous exclamatives, the childlike simplicity of the epithet happy, suggesting an intense emotional state and simply pleasure in being able to write and send a letter. We then have here the anaphora, tell him the page I didn't write, tell him I only said the syntax. And on the one hand, we could interpret this as a yearning with these passionate imperatives, yearning to reveal her feelings and to share and communicate her strength and her passion. These entreaties towards a letter which can reveal her emotions suggest a real depth of feeling. However, on the other hand, we could interpret them as faltering, as hesitant. The unfinished sentence or the unfinished line, tell him, and then she starts again, tell him the page didn't write, tell him, with the faltering dashes, could suggest that she's struggling to articulate her feelings. And the fact that she can't convey her feelings directly to him, she's having to instruct a letter with these passionate imperatives, suggests some sort of lack of agency or lack of power for her to really express her true feelings. Certainly we can see this with the fact that there's a page that she didn't write, with the dash here at the end representing an absence, a lack of being able, or a lack of communication, or a lack of meaningful communication. And similarly, I only said the syntax. Again, the language seems to be inadequate, or there's something that is missing from her sentence. I only said the syntax and left the verb and pronoun out. She is unable to properly articulate her feelings, whether that is from social convention, being a woman unable to express herself freely, or perhaps she's just too emotional and can't express what she wants to. We are not sure. We definitely can perceive the speaker's emotional state as the speaker oscillates between frenzied activity and laborious crafting of her letter. If we look at this line here, tell him just how the fingers hurried, then how they waded, slow, slow. And Dickinson is very clever with her sound effects here. We've got lots of short, clipped vowel sounds. The short E, tell, and him, and just. They're quick, short vowel sounds. And again, fingers and hurried. You've got the assonance of those and I sounds, very short, snappy sounds, reflecting that quick, sharp, frenzied activity of her writing down her feelings very quickly. However, we then also see how her writing slows down as she perhaps struggles to articulate herself. Then how they waded, slow, slow. And you've got here repetition of these long vowel sounds the O here, and the use of dashes suggests this laborious difficulty of writing down her ideas, and the verb to wade suggests that she feels weighed down and difficult to navigate her thoughts and difficulty to articulate herself clearly in writing. And this idea of wading, something being heavy and difficult, contrasts with the idea of the light-hearted, happy letter, that joyous, those joyous exclamatives at the start, suggesting this real intense emotional state that seems to swap between intensities of feeling. Certainly Dickinson suggests that if the letter had eyes, then the letter could see visible proof of that overwhelming emotion. She suggests that the letter could see what moved them so, showing that there's some sort of visible evidence of this intense emotional state that her love letter has created. However, the tone then perhaps becomes a little bit more flirtatious, a little bit more witty, a bit coy, a bit coquettish. The speaker says, "Tell him it wasn't a practiced writer. You guessed from the way the sentence toiled." Now, perhaps here the speaker's being, or Dickinson's being quite self-conscious, because it is clear that Dickinson, or the speaker of the poem, is a practiced writer. Here we get a sense of false modesty, just being quite playful. Furthermore, Dickinson uses the senses and suggests that the letter can hear her bodice tug behind it. So if the letter could hear it, we'd be able to hear her bodice tugging and moving. Perhaps she's moving around, or the speaker's moving around with the passion of writing this letter. But the reference to the bodice, this intimate clothing, again suggests something quite flirtatious. The speaker again suggests that she's unable to adequately communicate her feelings to her lover. Dickinson writes, "For it would split his heart to know it, and then you and I were silenter." It would split his heart. We could interpret this as the man that she is writing to, his love would be split. It would be split perhaps between his wife and the feelings he might have for the speaker of this poem. We might perceive that this poem is about Charles Wordsworth, who was a married vicar and who moved thousands of miles away to pursue a career, and Dickinson is writing to him. However, split his heart, whilst it could suggest this destructive division that her words would cause, there could be something hopeful, a slight hopeful subtext. And this is when we need to understand the context of the word split that Dickinson uses in some of her other poems. In another poem, Dickinson writes, "Split the lark, and you'll find the music, bulb after bulb, in silver rolled." This suggests something beautiful can come from division, something uplifting, something valuable and precious, like the idea of silver coming from inside the lark. And so although Dickinson is aware of the destruction that would come from communicating her feelings to the lover, she also suggests that something beautiful, something hopeful, something valuable could also come. Now, the start of the third stanza changes tone again. We have perhaps here a little bit more kind of playful innuendo, perhaps this sort of imaginative yearning, where we have the hint of a lover's scene, of lovers having spent the night together and parting in the morning. She is right, the poem is here about the fact that she stayed up all night, or the speaker stayed up all night to finish writing the letter. However, the language she uses perhaps suggests she's blurring this with the idea of staying up all night with her lover. Dickinson writes, "Tell him, night finished before we finished." Perhaps a sense of spending the entire night with her lover. Finished is often a euphemism used for sexual satisfaction. So they had, she's implying that they had a long night of playfulness. And the old cock kept neighing day, the sense that time's running out, but they've had this whole wonderful night together, and you got sleepy and begged to be ended. This idea of begging, that verb, could perhaps again be kind of playfully suggestive or have some sort of sexual subtext to it. So here we can see perhaps frustrated imaginings or longings of such a lover's scene. However, that is the innuendo. On the surface, Dickinson is writing about how the speaker spent all night writing the letter. And even the letter got sleepy because she spent so long crafting it, trying to communicate her ideas. The poem ends with the speaker instructing the letter to be coquettish, to keep itself hidden. But if he asks where you are hid, until tomorrow, happy letter, gesture coquette and shake your head. The speaker is perhaps asking the letter to be coy, to be flirtatious, not to reveal its contents. And is this playing hard to get? Is this a flirtatious gesture? Or is this a realisation that perhaps she will never be adequately able to communicate her feelings? She won't in reality be able to share this letter. It will be permanently delayed until tomorrow. Those temporal adverbs perhaps suggesting this continuous putting off, this continuous waiting, that suggests that she'll never be able to articulate her feelings. And perhaps we get a similar sense of regretfulness earlier in the poem, with the sibilance that can be found earlier in stanza 1. I only said the syntax. Perhaps the S sounds to create a more wishful tone. Perhaps decorum does not allow her to say any more than the syntax, which is just sort of the bare sentence structure. So I have here interpreted the poem from the perspective of it being about writing a letter to a lover. Some critics interpret this poem as a poem that is actually about the art and craft of writing itself. It is a poem about writing poems. If we perceive writing the letter to be an analogy for writing her own poems, we can see here that Dickinson revels in the process of writing. Tell him just how the fingers hurried, then how they waded slow. The changeable inspiration of a writer, which allows writers to sort of ecstatically pour out their ideas and their feelings, but then how sometimes the craft takes much longer and they have to wade with this slow. So once again, just as before you could talk about the elongated vowel sounds with slow, and the repetition slowing down the pace of this line, as well as the dashes, which again fragment the line, slowing it down, and again the short vowel sounds, the clipped vowel sounds in here, which gives it its pace. There is also the suggestion that Dickinson really considers the language choice, that the letter quibbles, that kind of quite light-hearted verb quibbles, with what she says. Tell him, no, you may quibble there, suggesting that perhaps this is kind of an analogy for the conversation she may have with herself as Dickinson reconsiders her own language choices, trying to find the most articulate word. In the final stanza, Dickinson paints a scenario of her having stayed up all night to write, and here we have this anaphora, and the old clock kept neighing day, and you got sleepy. The repetition of the and at the start of the lines creates this drawn out process, suggesting her detailed dedication to her craft. At the end of the poem, Dickinson does not send her letter. This letter is not for practical communication. It's not to be received, which suggests that it is the process of writing the letter that she enjoyed. And so we could perceive that she sacrifices or abandons hope of a relationship with a man in favour of a literary vocation. This could be an analogy for her, suggesting that she will remain writing as opposed to actively pursuing some sort of conclusion or some sort of end point to her communication, that it is the craft of writing that she enjoys. She instructs the letter to shake its head, to refuse to be received by the addressee of the letter. And so we can see that it is perhaps the writing of the letter, the writing of the letter that she enjoys. This poem could also be interpreted as revealing Dickinson's relationship with God. The emphatic capitalisation of him suggests that this poem could be directed to God. And the fact that she cannot communicate directly with God, she needs the letter to intercede on her behalf, suggests a sense of distance between her and God. And perhaps Dickinson here is critiquing or questioning or sceptical about the need for intercession for a worshipper to gain access for God. So the need for a go-between, the need for a priest or the church to intercede on behalf of its worshippers. And perhaps here we can see or we can hear mirrors of the poem This World Is Not Conclusion, where she critiques the pulpit's strong hallelujahs which roll, a sense that actually to gain access to the God, do we need priests or the church to intercede on our behalf? There is also a sense that Dickinson is unable to communicate her true feelings to God. Dickinson writes that she left the verb and the pronoun out, suggesting although she has the form, the syntax, that she can't fill the form with the words that she actually wants. The content of her message to God cannot be really truly communicated. And unlike many others in her New England Puritan community, she was unable to publicly declare her faith. She felt that she could not personally do that. And Dickinson is aware of the impact of her skepticism towards faith. Dickinson suggests that it would split his heart to know it. This is the blasphemous content would be destructive. And she's unwilling to communicate her crisis in faith for fear of the consequences. And then you and I will silent her. It is not that she wants to give up on God. It's just that she wants the ability to question and to raise issues that she's been thinking about. She doesn't want to end her relationship with God. And at the end of the poem, Dickinson emphasises that she is unable to utter her feelings in the society in which she lives. The letter has to remain hidden. Her scepticism, her questioning would not have been received well in Dickinson's Puritan community, and so she's forced into secrecy. The lives of women in 19th century New England would have been highly restricted, and we can sense this frustration in this poem. The anaphora of tell him, and the fact that she cannot communicate directly with the recipient of the letter suggests a frustrated restriction, a struggle to communicate freely. And you see similar sense of restriction. You've got the verb tug here. You could hear the bodice tug. And again, this sense of restriction with the bodice tight around her, a sense of claustrophobia of being a woman. Later in stanza 3, Dickinson writes, tell him just how she sealed you, cautious. Now, is this exclamative cautious, implying that Dickinson or the speaker had to be very wary of the content of the letter? She had to be cautious in sending this. Was her behaviour in speaking freely about or attempting to speak about her feelings, was that improper? Would that have been condoned? Is there a censorious tone here? Is this cautious, the voice of her community judging her actions? In marrying, a woman would have had to give up a lot of her freedoms, and at the end of the poem, Dickinson decides not to pursue her love. And this could be a statement that she will not become submissive, she will not become a female restricted by male authority. She ends the poem by retaining her independence as a writer.